The morning sun painted the Afghan mountains in shades of gold and crimson as Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell adjusted her gear one final time. At 26, she had already proven herself in 3 combat deployments, but today felt different. The intelligence briefing had been unusually tense, and the looks from some of her male counterparts carried an edge she couldn't quite place. Sarah had joined the Navy's special warfare community through sheer determination and exceptional skill. Growing up in rural Montana, she had learned to shoot before she could properly ride a bike. Her father, a former Marine, had taught her that respect was earned through actions, not words. When she scored the highest marks in her SEAL training qualification course, breaking several records in the process, she thought she had finally earned that respect. The mission briefing room buzzed with quiet conversation as Team Leader Commander Jake Morrison outlined their objective. A high-value target had been located in a remote village near the Pakistani border. Intelligence suggested the target was planning a major attack on coalition forces within the week. The mission was straightforward: infiltrate, capture or eliminate, and extract. "Mitchell, you'll provide overwatch from the eastern ridge," Morrison announced, his voice carrying across the room. "Your position will be critical for our extraction route." Sarah nodded, understanding the importance of her role. As the team's designated marksman, she had saved countless lives with her precision shooting. Her custom rifle, a modified M110 that she had personally zeroed and adjusted, had become legendary among her unit. Other teams specifically requested her for high-risk operations. But as the briefing concluded, Sarah noticed something troubling. Several team members exchanged glances that seemed loaded with meaning. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez, whom she had served with for over 2 years, avoided making eye contact entirely. Even Petty Officer First Class David Chun, who had personally thanked her for saving his life during their last mission, seemed distant and cold. The helicopter ride to the insertion point was unusually quiet. Normally, the team would engage in light banter to ease pre-mission tension. Today, the silence felt oppressive. Sarah checked her equipment methodically, running through her mental checklist as she had hundreds of times before. Her rifle was clean and properly sighted. Her communication equipment functioned perfectly. Her medical kit was fully stocked. Everything was as it should be, yet something felt fundamentally wrong. As they approached the insertion point, Morrison's voice crackled through her headset. "Change of plans, Mitchell. We're dropping you at a different overwatch position. Better sight lines on the target compound." Sarah frowned as she studied her map. The new position was further from the village and offered no clear extraction route. More troubling, it was completely isolated from any backup positions. In all her training and experience, she had never been placed in such a tactically unsound location. "Sir, this position doesn't align with our standard operating procedures," she said into her headset, trying to keep her voice professional despite growing concern. "The mission parameters have changed based on updated intelligence," Morrison replied curtly. "Follow orders, Lieutenant." The helicopter touched down briefly in a cloud of dust and debris. Sarah grabbed her gear and jumped out, immediately seeking cover as the aircraft lifted off. As the sound of rotors faded into the distance, an eerie silence settled over the rocky terrain. She was alone in enemy territory, miles from the nearest friendly forces. Sarah quickly established her position on a rocky outcrop that provided decent concealment, but poor fields of fire. The village lay nearly 3 miles away, well beyond the effective range of her rifle for precision shooting. The position made no tactical sense whatsoever. A cold realization began to settle in her stomach as she tried to raise the team on her radio. Static. Nothing but static on all frequencies. She checked her equipment again, performing every diagnostic she knew. The radio was functioning perfectly, which meant either her team was out of range or they were deliberately not responding. Given their current mission profile, being out of range was impossible. Hours passed as Sarah maintained her position, watching through her scope as the sun climbed higher in the Afghan sky. She had seen no movement from the target compound, no signs of her team, and received no communications of any kind. The isolation was complete, and absolute. As afternoon approached, Sarah heard the distant sound of helicopters returning. Relief flooded through her as she prepared for extraction. But as the aircraft came into view, her blood turned cold. These weren't American helicopters. The distinctive outline of Soviet-era Mi-17s filled her scope, and she could see armed men hanging from the sides. The helicopters circled her position like vultures, and Sarah realized with crystal clarity that she had been betrayed. Someone had provided her exact location to hostile forces. As she watched, ropes dropped from the aircraft, and armed men began fast roping down around her position. Sarah's training took over as adrenaline flooded her system. She grabbed her rifle and gear, abandoning the rocky outcrop, just as automatic weapons fire began chewing up the rocks where she had been lying moments before. The sound of bullets ricocheting off stone filled the air as she bounded from cover to cover, using every bit of terrain to mask her movement. The terrain worked against her. The rocky hillside offered little concealment, and her pursuers had the advantage of numbers and positioning. She could hear them calling to each other in Pashto, coordinating their search. These weren't random insurgents. They moved with military precision and discipline. Sarah found temporary shelter behind a large boulder and tried her radio again. Still nothing. She was completely cut off, abandoned by her own team, and surrounded by hostile forces who knew exactly where to find her. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. She counted at least 12 hostiles, all armed with automatic weapons and moving in coordinated fire teams. They had her position bracketed and were slowly closing the net. Escape seemed impossible, but Sarah had not survived 3 combat deployments by accepting defeat. Using skills learned in SEER school, she began moving through the rocky terrain like a ghost. Every shadow, every boulder, every depression in the ground became part of her escape route. She moved when the wind picked up to mask the sound of her movement. She froze when aircraft passed overhead. She became one with the unforgiving Afghan landscape. But the net was closing. As evening approached, Sarah found herself pinned down in a narrow ravine with nowhere to run. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed off the rocky walls. Voices grew louder. They had found her trail and were following it methodically. Sarah checked her ammunition. 3 magazines for her rifle, 2 for her sidearm. Against 12 hostiles, the math was not in her favor. But she had not come this far to surrender without a fight. If this was where her story ended, she would make sure it was written in terms her father would be proud of. The first hostile appeared at the mouth of the ravine just as the sun touched the western mountains. Sarah's rifle spoke once, and the man dropped. Immediately, automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions. Rock fragments exploded around her as bullets searched for their target. Sarah moved again, using the confusion to relocate to a better position deeper in the ravine. But as she moved, she heard something that made her blood freeze. English voices, American accents, coordinating with the hostile forces. Her own teammates were hunting her. "She's in the ravine," came Morrison's voice, clear and unmistakable. "Block the far end while we drive her toward you." The betrayal was complete. Her own unit, men she had served with and bled alongside, had sold her to the enemy. As darkness fell over the Afghan mountains, Sarah Mitchell realized she was fighting for her life against forces both foreign and domestic. The reason for the betrayal remained unclear, but the reality was inescapable. She had been marked for death by her own people, and now she was trapped in a rocky grave with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The SEALs who had sworn to never leave a teammate behind had not only abandoned her, they had actively participated in her execution. As gunfire echoed through the ravine and muzzle flashes lit up the growing darkness, Sarah prepared for what might be her final stand. But somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice that sounded remarkably like her father's reminded her that the fight wasn't over until she drew her last breath. The night was just beginning, and Sarah Mitchell was far from finished. The ravine became Sarah's fortress and her tomb simultaneously. As darkness deepened, she used every shadow and rock formation to her advantage, moving like a specter through terrain that would challenge even experienced mountain fighters. Her pursuers had numbers and firepower, but Sarah had desperation and a lifetime of training that had prepared her for exactly this moment. The sound of boots on rock echoed through the narrow canyon as her hunters closed in from both ends. Sarah pressed herself against the cold stone wall, controlling her breathing to remain silent. Her rifle was trained on the mouth of the ravine where she expected the first target to appear. Patience had always been her greatest asset as a sniper, and now it might be the only thing keeping her alive. A shadow moved against the starlit sky. Sarah's finger found the trigger, but she held her fire. One shot would reveal her position to the entire team. Instead, she watched as the figure moved closer, close enough for her to recognize the distinctive gait of Petty Officer Chun. The man whose life she had saved just 3 months ago was now hunting her like an animal. Sarah slipped her combat knife from its sheath, the blade catching a sliver of moonlight. As Chun passed her hiding spot, she moved with the fluid precision that had made her legendary among Special Operations Forces. Her hand clamped over his mouth as the blade found its mark between his ribs, angled upward toward his heart. Chin's eyes went wide with shock and recognition before the light faded from them forever. She lowered his body silently to the ground and took his ammunition. For additional magazines for her rifle, plus his night vision goggles and radio. As she adjusted the headset, she could hear the chatter of her former teammates coordinating their search. Chun, report your position. Morrison's voice crackled through the static. Sarah keyed the microphone, disguising her voice in the electronic distortion. Position secure. No contact. Copy. Continue sweep toward Rally Point Alpha. The deception bought her precious minutes. Sarah moved deeper into the ravine system, using Chin's night vision to navigate the treacherous terrain. The rocky maze extended further than she had realized, offering multiple routes and hiding places. For the first time since the helicopters had appeared, she felt a spark of hope. But that hope was short-lived. The sound of additional aircraft approaching filled the night air. Not helicopters this time, but fixed-wing aircraft. As Sarah watched through her scope, she saw the distinctive silhouette of a Predator drone circling overhead. The enemy had called in air support, and thermal imaging would make her concealment nearly impossible. Sarah knew she had minutes before the drone's sensors located her heat signature. She began moving again, using every technique she had learned to mask her thermal footprint. Cold rocks could absorb body heat temporarily. Water could distort thermal readings. But in the arid Afghan mountains, both resources were scarce. A small trickle of water ran through the deepest part of the ravine, probably snow melt from the high peaks. Sarah followed it upstream, hoping it might lead to a cave or overhang that could provide thermal concealment. The stream grew larger as she climbed, eventually becoming a small waterfall that cascaded down from an opening in the rock face above. The climb was treacherous in the dark, even with night vision. Loose rocks threatened to give way under her boots, and the sound of falling stones would instantly reveal her position. But Sarah had grown up climbing in the Montana Rockies, and her hands found purchase where others would find only smooth stone. She reached the opening just as the drone's thermal sensor swept across the ravine below. The cave extended back into the mountain, carved by centuries of flowing water. It was shallow, but offered complete concealment from aerial observation. For the first time in hours, Sarah allowed herself a moment to catch her breath and assess her situation. Her radio crackled with increasing activity. Her former teammates were realizing that Chun was missing, and their search pattern was becoming more systematic. They had called in reinforcements, including local militia who knew the terrain better than any American ever could. The net was closing again, but now Sarah had a defensive position that could be held. "We have thermal anomalies near the waterfall," came a voice she didn't recognize. Probably the drone operator, likely stationed hundreds of miles away at Bagram Airfield. "Recommend investigation of the cave system." Sarah smiled grimly as she prepared her rifle. "Let them come." The cave opening created a natural choke point that would force attackers to approach one at a time. Her ammunition was limited, but in this position, every shot could count for multiple enemies. The first figure appeared at the base of the waterfall within minutes. Through her scope, Sarah recognized Petty Officer Rodriguez, her former spotter, and the man she had trusted with her life on dozens of missions. The betrayal stung, but she had moved beyond personal feelings. This was now purely about survival. Rodriguez began climbing the rock face with practiced skill. He was a good climber, methodical and careful, but Sarah knew his technique. She had trained with him for 2 years. When he reached for a particular handhold that she knew would put him off balance for a split second, Sarah took the shot. The rifle's report echoed through the canyon like thunder. Rodriguez fell without a sound, his body disappearing into the darkness below. Immediately, automatic weapons fire erupted from the canyon floor, bullets sparking off the rocks around the cave entrance. Contact! Contact! She's in the cave system above the falls. Morrison's voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air. Sarah moved deeper into the cave as bullets whined through the opening. The narrow confines amplified the sound, making it seem like the entire mountain was under artillery bombardment. But the rocky walls provided complete protection, and the cave's depth gave her room to maneuver. She found a position about 20 feet back from the entrance where she could still observe the opening while remaining in complete darkness. Anyone climbing toward the cave would be silhouetted against the night sky, making them perfect targets. It was a defensive position that could be held indefinitely, assuming her ammunition lasted. The gunfire stopped as suddenly as it had started. In the ringing silence that followed, Sarah could hear voices below discussing their options. They were smart enough to realize that a direct assault on her position would be suicide. Someone was calling for explosives to collapse the cave entrance. Sarah used the lull to explore the rear of the cave. Her flashlight revealed that the passage continued deeper into the mountain, though it narrowed considerably. If they tried to seal her in, she might have another way out. The air current suggested the passage connected to the surface somewhere. Mitchell! Morrison's voice echoed up from below. This doesn't have to end badly. Come down, and we can work something out. Sarah almost laughed at the absurdity of the offer. These men had tried to have her killed by foreign insurgents, and now they wanted to negotiate. She keyed her radio, broadcasting on the frequency she knew they were monitoring. You sold me out to terrorists, Morrison. There's nothing to work out. A long silence followed before Morrison's voice returned, colder and more professional. You've killed 2 American servicemen tonight, Mitchell. That makes you a traitor. Surrender now and face court-martial, or we'll end this here. The only traitors here are the ones who betrayed their oath, Sarah replied. Chun and Rodriguez made their choice when they decided to hunt down their own teammate. Sarah turned off her radio and focused on the cave entrance. She could hear movement below, the sound of men positioning themselves for another assault. They would try to rush her position under cover of darkness, probably using smoke or flashbang grenades to disorient her before the assault. She was right. The first grenade came bouncing up the rock face, clattering into the cave entrance before exploding in a brilliant flash of light and sound. Even with her eyes closed and ears covered, the concussion was overwhelming in the confined space. But Sarah had positioned herself far enough back to avoid the worst effects. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard boots on rock. The assault team was climbing toward her position, using the confusion of the grenade to mask their approach. Sarah blinked away the after images and focused on the cave entrance, her rifle ready. The first figure appeared as a shadow against the stars. Sarah's shot took him center mass, and he tumbled backward into his teammates. Curses and shouts echoed from below as the assault team retreated to regroup. Bring up the heavy weapons, Morrison ordered. We're going to bring down this entire section of mountain. Sarah knew she was out of time. Anti-tank rockets or heavy machine gun fire would turn her defensive position into a tomb. She grabbed her gear and began moving toward the rear of the cave, following the narrow passage deeper into the mountain. the walls closing around her as she crawled through spaces barely wide enough for her body. The passage seemed to go on forever, winding through the mountain's heart like a worm tunnel. Sarah's flashlight created dancing shadows on the wet rock walls as she pushed forward, fighting claustrophobia and the growing certainty that she was crawling toward a dead end. Behind her, she heard the distinctive sound of explosives detonating. They were collapsing the cave entrance, sealing off her escape route. Now she truly was trapped in the mountain's bowels, with no choice but to continue forward and hope the passage led somewhere. The air grew thinner as she climbed, suggesting she was gaining altitude. Her flashlight beam began to reveal different rock formations, sedimentary layers that spoke of ancient geological processes. She was no geologist, but the changing stones suggested she was moving through different parts of the mountain. After what felt like hours of crawling, the passage began to widen. Sarah found herself in a larger chamber, tall enough to stand upright for the first time since entering the rear tunnel. Her flashlight revealed multiple passages leading away from the chamber, like spokes on a wheel. One passage carried a stronger air current, suggesting it led to the surface. Sarah chose it without hesitation, following the flow of air through twisting corridors that seemed to spiral upward through the mountain. Her legs burned from the constant climbing, and her water supply was running dangerously low. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity underground, Sarah saw stars through a crack in the rocks above. The passage had led to a hidden exit high on the mountain's eastern face, miles from where her former teammates were still searching. She emerged into the pre-dawn darkness, breathing fresh mountain air for the first time in hours. But her ordeal was far from over. She was alone in hostile territory, miles from any friendly forces, with limited supplies and a price on her head. Her own unit had tried to murder her, which meant she couldn't trust anyone in the American military command structure. Someone high up the chain had ordered her elimination, and until she knew who and why, everyone was a potential enemy. Sarah looked out over the vast Afghan landscape, painted silver by starlight. Somewhere out there were answers, and somewhere out there was justice. She had survived the first attempt on her life, but she knew there would be others. The people who had betrayed her wouldn't stop until she was dead. But they had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated Sarah Mitchell, and now she was free, armed, and very, very angry. The hunters had become the hunted, and the real fight was just beginning. Dawn broke over the Hindu Kush Mountains as Sarah Mitchell emerged from her rocky sanctuary, bloodied but unbowed. The events of the previous night had stripped away everything she thought she knew about loyalty, honor, and the brotherhood of arms. But they had also revealed something else, a steel core of determination that no betrayal could break. Sarah needed answers, and she knew exactly where to start looking. Every military operation generated paperwork, communication logs, and digital footprints. Someone had orchestrated her assassination attempt, and that someone had left tracks. The challenge would be accessing that information while remaining invisible to the very people who wanted her dead. She began moving east through the treacherous mountain terrain, staying high on the ridgelines where she could observe the valleys below while remaining concealed from ground forces. Her destination was Forward Operating Base Chapman, located 30 miles away across some of the most hostile territory in Afghanistan. Chapman housed the Regional Intelligence Center, where classified communications were processed and stored. The journey would take her through 3 river valleys controlled by Taliban forces, across 2 major roads that were constantly patrolled by both American and Afghan military units, and over mountain passes that had claimed the lives of countless travelers over the centuries. With limited water, no food, and only the ammunition she carried, it seemed like a suicide mission. But Sarah had advantages that her enemies didn't expect. Her sniper training had taught her to move unseen across any terrain. Her intelligence background had given her detailed knowledge of American military procedures and security protocols. Most importantly, her former teammates thought she was dead, buried under tons of rock in a collapsed cave system. She spent the first day observing Taliban patrol patterns in the valley below. The insurgents moved predictably, following established routes that avoided the most difficult terrain. Sarah timed their movements, noting that a 30-minute window existed between patrols where she could cross the valley floor undetected. As evening approached, Sarah began her descent. The rocky slope was treacherous in fading light, but she had learned to move like a mountain goat during her childhood in Montana. Every step was carefully placed to avoid loose rocks that might start a landslide or create noise that would attract attention. She reached the valley floor just as the last Taliban patrol disappeared around a bend in the river. Moving swiftly but silently, Sarah crossed the open ground and began climbing the opposite slope. The timing was perfect until disaster struck. A loose boulder, probably weakened by recent heavy rains, gave way under her weight. Sarah watched in horror as it crashed down the mountainside, creating an avalanche of smaller rocks that sounded like gunfire in the still evening air. The noise echoed through the valley, immediately attracting attention from every direction. Shouts erupted from the Taliban compound near the river. Vehicle engines roared to life as search parties prepared to investigate the disturbance. Sarah pressed herself against the rock face, hoping that darkness would provide enough concealment to avoid detection. Flashlight beams began sweeping the mountainside as armed men spread out through the valley. Sarah knew she had minutes before the search reached her position. She began climbing again, abandoning stealth for speed as she raced toward the ridgeline. A spotlight suddenly blazed to life, scanning the mountain face methodically. Sarah froze as the beam passed just inches from her position, then resumed climbing as soon as it moved away. The voices below were getting closer, and she could hear dogs barking in the distance. Sarah reached a narrow ledge about 200 feet up the cliff face just as the first searchers arrived at the bottom of the rock slide. She pressed herself into a tiny crevice between two boulders, making herself as small as possible while the spotlight swept back and forth overhead. The search continued for over an hour before the Taliban fighters concluded that the rock slide had been caused by natural erosion. Sarah remained hidden until well after midnight, listening as the sounds of the search party faded into the distance. When silence finally returned to the valley, she resumed her climb. The second day brought new challenges. American helicopter patrols were active in the area, and Sarah recognized the distinctive sound of her own unit's aircraft. Morrison was leading search teams through the valleys, probably looking for her body to confirm a kill. She watched from concealment as familiar helicopters passed overhead, carrying men she had once trusted with her life. Water became critical by the third day. Sarah's supply was exhausted, and the mountain springs marked on her map had proved to be dry or contaminated. Dehydration was beginning to affect her judgment and coordination, making the dangerous mountain crossings even more treacherous. She found salvation in an abandoned shepherd's hut, hidden in a small canyon that didn't appear on any military map. The stone building contained emergency supplies left by travelers over the years, canned food, bottled water, and basic medical supplies. Sarah rationed herself carefully, taking only what she needed to survive while leaving the cache intact for other desperate souls. The hut also contained something unexpected, a shortwave radio, old but functional. Sarah tuned it to various frequencies, listening for communications that might provide intelligence about the ongoing search for her. What she heard made her blood run cold. Priority Alpha Traffic, Authentication Bravo 77, came a voice she didn't recognize. Package delivery confirmed successful. Asset terminated per operational requirements. The formal language of covert operations was unmistakable. Someone was reporting her successful assassination to higher authorities. But Sarah was very much alive, which meant her enemies were about to discover their operation had failed. The hunt would intensify exponentially once they realized their mistake. Sarah reached Forward Operating Base Chapman on the fourth night, approaching from the east, where security was lighter due to the mountainous terrain. She had served at Chapman during her first deployment and knew every fence line, guard post, and security camera position. More importantly, she knew the shift schedules and patrol routes that would allow her to penetrate the perimeter undetected. The base was on high alert, with increased patrols and additional security measures that hadn't been present during her previous assignment. Someone was clearly concerned about potential threats. Though Sarah doubted, they expected the threat to come from within their own ranks. She waited until 300 hours, when human alertness was at its lowest point, before making her move. The eastern perimeter fence was equipped with motion sensors, but Sarah knew they had a blind spot where the fence crossed a small drainage ditch. Maintenance crews had created the gap to allow access for repairs, and it had never been properly secured. Sarah slipped through the fence like a ghost, timing her movement to coincide with the passage of a supply convoy that would mask any sound. Once inside the perimeter, she moved through shadows and maintenance areas that she knew would be unguarded during the night shift. The intelligence center was located in a hardened bunker near the center of the base, surrounded by multiple layers of security. But Sarah wasn't planning a frontal assault. During her previous deployment, she had discovered a maintenance tunnel that connected the bunker to the base's primary communications array. The tunnel was used by technicians to service the underground cables, and it was rarely monitored. She found the tunnel entrance exactly where she remembered it, concealed beneath a concrete slab behind the motor pool. The heavy cover required both hands to lift, and Sarah strained against its weight while listening for approaching patrols. Once open, she dropped into the narrow space below and carefully replaced the cover above her. The tunnel was barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, filled with cables and pipes that made navigation difficult in complete darkness. Sarah moved by feel, following the main cable bundle that she knew led directly to the intelligence center. The air was stale and humid, making breathing difficult as she squeezed through the confined space. After 20 minutes of careful movement, Sarah reached the access panel beneath the intelligence center. She could hear voices above as the night shift conducted their routine monitoring activities. Using tools from her survival kit, she carefully removed the access panel and peered into the room above. 3 analysts were on duty, focused on computer screens displaying real-time intelligence feeds from throughout the region. Sarah waited until one analyst left for a coffee break before making her move. She slipped into the room silently, approaching the remaining 2 analysts from their blind spot. "Don't turn around, don't make a sound, and you'll live through this," Sarah whispered, pressing the muzzle of her pistol against the nearest analyst's neck. Both men froze, understanding immediately that their lives depended on complete cooperation. Sarah had chosen her timing perfectly. The missing analyst would be gone for at least 10 minutes, giving her enough time to access the classified database. "I need you to access the mission logs for Operation Nightfall," Sarah said quietly. "Authentication codes, communication records, and personnel assignments." The analyst's hands shook as he typed commands into his computer. Sarah watched the screen as files appeared, revealing the operational details of her betrayal. What she saw made her stomach turn with rage and disgust. Operation Nightfall had indeed been a setup from the beginning. But it wasn't just about eliminating Sarah Mitchell. According to the classified documents, Sarah had stumbled onto evidence of a much larger conspiracy involving weapons smuggling, drug trafficking, and the systematic theft of military supplies. Several high-ranking officers were named in the files, including personnel at the Pentagon who were coordinating the illegal activities. Sarah had been marked for death not because of anything she had done wrong, but because she had seen too much during a previous mission and asked too many questions. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Millions of dollars in weapons and supplies were being diverted to black market dealers who sold them to the highest bidders, including Taliban and Al-Qaeda forces. American soldiers were dying from bullets fired from weapons that had been stolen from their own supply convoys. Sarah memorized every name, every detail, every piece of evidence that could expose the conspiracy. But as she prepared to leave, alarms suddenly began blaring throughout the base. Red lights flashed in the intelligence center as automated systems detected her unauthorized access to classified files. Security breach in the intelligence center. announced the base public address system. All personnel to emergency stations. This is not a drill. Sarah heard boots running in the corridor outside as security teams responded to the alarm. She was trapped in the heart of the most secure facility on the base, with multiple levels of armed guards between her and freedom. Escape seemed impossible, but Sarah Mitchell had already proved that impossible was just another word for challenging. She turned to the two analysts, both of whom were staring at her with a mixture of fear and recognition. They knew who she was supposed to be dead, and they knew that her presence here meant everything they thought they knew about the war was a lie. "You have a choice," Sarah said calmly as the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. "You can sound the alarm and become part of the cover-up, or you can help me expose the truth about what's really happening here." The door burst open just as the lead analyst made his decision. His hand moved toward the silent alarm button that would bring security forces directly to their location. But instead of pressing it, he pulled out the data storage device containing all the evidence Sarah needed. "Take this," he whispered, pressing the device into her hand. "Someone needs to know what we've really been fighting for." Gunfire erupted in the corridor outside as Sarah prepared for what might be her final battle. But this time, she wasn't fighting alone. The truth was now in her hands, and she would make sure it reached the people who could act on it. The real war was just beginning. The intelligence center erupted into chaos as security forces flooded the corridors, their boots echoing against concrete walls like thunder. Sarah pocketed the data storage device and assessed her options. The maintenance tunnel was no longer viable. Security teams would seal it within minutes. The ventilation system was too narrow for human passage. That left only one route, straight through the heart of the storm. Sergeant Timothy Walsh, the analyst who had helped her, was already destroying evidence of their brief cooperation. His partner, Corporal Martinez, sat frozen at his workstation, paralyzed by the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. Both men understood that their lives had changed forever in the span of those few minutes. "Is there another way out of here?" Sarah asked Walsh quietly, keeping her weapon trained on the door. "Emergency exit leads to the communications array," Walsh replied without looking up from his computer. "But it's alarmed and monitored." "Everything's alarmed now," Sarah pointed out. "What about the power grid?" Walsh's eyes widened as he understood her plan. The base's electrical system was centralized, with backup generators that kicked in automatically during power failures. If she could create a blackout, the resulting confusion might provide the cover she needed to escape. "Electrical substation is 50 meters north of here," Walsh said. "But it's heavily guarded." "Not anymore," Sarah replied, listening to the sounds of security teams being deployed throughout the base. "Everyone's responding to this alarm." Sarah moved to the emergency exit and carefully opened the door. The corridor beyond was dimly lit and apparently empty, though she could hear voices and radio chatter from multiple directions. The base was mobilizing its entire security force to find one person, which meant they were taking no chances this time. She slipped into the corridor and began moving toward the communications array, using shadows and alcoves to avoid the security cameras that tracked movement throughout the facility. Her knowledge of the base layout was proving invaluable. She knew which cameras had blind spots and which corridors were monitored only sporadically. The electrical substation was housed in a concrete bunker designed to withstand direct artillery hits. Under normal circumstances, it would be guarded by at least 4 security personnel. But as Sarah approached, she could see that the guard posts were empty. Every available person had been pulled into the search for her. The substation's exterior was protected by a heavy steel door secured with both electronic locks and mechanical backup systems. Sarah studied the locking mechanism, recognizing it as a military-grade security system she had encountered during previous operations. The electronic components could be bypassed, but it would take time she didn't have. Instead, she focused on the ventilation intake for the bunker. The metal grating was secured with standard bolts that could be removed with a multi-tool from her survival kit. Working quickly but quietly, Sarah removed the grating and squeezed through the narrow opening into the ventilation shaft. The shaft led directly into the main electrical room, where massive transformers and switching equipment hummed with barely contained power. Sarah had no intention of electrocuting herself, but she knew exactly which systems to target to create maximum confusion with minimum permanent damage. The base's lighting grid was controlled by a series of circuit breakers housed in a central panel. Sarah began systematically throwing breakers, starting with non-essential systems and working her way up to critical infrastructure. Within minutes, half the base was plunged into darkness. Emergency lighting activated immediately, bathing everything in an eerie red glow that would make identification and coordination much more difficult for the security forces. Sarah could hear confused shouts echoing across the base as units tried to reposition in the altered environment. But her sabotage had an unexpected consequence. The base's emergency protocols included automatic lockdown procedures that sealed all exits and entrances until the threat could be assessed. Sarah found herself trapped inside the base she was trying to escape, with every exit now electronically secured and heavily guarded. She needed a new plan, and she needed it quickly. The partial power outage had bought her time, but it had also focused attention on the electrical system. Security teams would be converging on the substation within minutes. Sarah remembered something from her previous deployment that might provide a solution. The base's water treatment facility was located outside the main perimeter, connected to the primary facility by an underground pipeline. During construction, workers had installed access hatches along the pipeline route for maintenance purposes. If she could reach the pipeline, she might be able to follow it beyond the security perimeter. The water treatment facility was located on the opposite side of the base, requiring her to cross nearly a mile of open ground while avoiding multiple security checkpoints. In darkness, with emergency protocols in effect, it seemed impossible. But Sarah had learned that impossible was just another tactical challenge to overcome. She began moving through the base using storm drains and utility corridors that weren't shown on standard security maps. These hidden passages had been installed during the original construction to provide access for maintenance crews, and they created a secret network beneath the official base layout. The storm drain system was flooded with several inches of muddy water that made movement slow and treacherous. Sarah crawled through the narrow tunnels on her hands and knees, following directional markers that indicated water flow toward the treatment facility. The smell was overwhelming, and twice she had to stop to avoid being sick from the combination of stagnant water and chemical contamination. After 30 minutes of underground movement, Sarah emerged from a drainage outlet near the base motor pool. The facility was bustling with activity as security teams organized search patterns and established checkpoints. Sarah counted at least 40 personnel, all armed and focused on finding her. She waited in the shadows until a supply convoy approached the motor pool checkpoint. The drivers were required to present identification and submit to vehicle searches, creating a bottleneck that drew all attention to the main gate. Sarah used the distraction to slip past the perimeter fence and begin moving toward the water treatment facility. The facility was smaller than she remembered, housing a cluster of buildings surrounded by chain-link fencing that was designed more to keep curious civilians out than to repel military-trained intruders. Sarah cut through the fence with wire cutters from her survival kit and approached the main building. The pipeline access hatch was located behind the primary settling tank, exactly where she remembered it from her previous deployment. The heavy metal cover required considerable effort to move, but Sarah managed to lift it enough to squeeze through the opening below. The pipeline was larger than she had expected, wide enough for a person to crawl through comfortably. Emergency lighting strips ran along the upper surface, providing enough illumination to navigate the underground passage. Sarah began moving through the pipeline, following it away from the base toward the secondary treatment facility located 2 miles to the east. The pipeline journey took over an hour, with Sarah stopping frequently to rest and listen for sounds of pursuit. The concrete tunnel echoed with the constant flow of water, making it impossible to hear whether security teams had discovered her escape route. She pressed forward, driven by the knowledge that every minute brought her closer to safety and closer to exposing the truth about the conspiracy that had nearly cost her life. She emerged from the pipeline at the secondary treatment facility to find it completely deserted. The automated systems continued their work without human supervision, processing water through a series of chemical and mechanical treatments. Sarah used the facility's communication equipment to contact the one person she trusted completely, her former commanding officer, Captain Rebecca Torres, who now worked at the Pentagon. Torres, came the familiar voice after several rings. "Captain, this is Lieutenant Mitchell. I need immediate extraction and protection." A long silence followed before Torres responded. "Mitchell, you're supposed to be dead. We received confirmation that you were killed in action 3 days ago." "The reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated," Sarah replied grimly. "I have evidence of a conspiracy involving senior military personnel. People tried to have me killed to keep me quiet." "Stay where you are," Torres ordered. "I'm sending a recovery team to your location." "Negative, Captain. I don't trust anyone in the normal chain of command. The corruption goes higher than you might think." Sarah transmitted the GPS coordinates of a remote location 15 miles from her current position. "Meet me there in 12 hours. Come alone, and bring whatever authentication you need to prove you're not compromised." She destroyed the communication equipment to prevent anyone from tracing the call and began moving toward the rendezvous point. The journey would take her through some of the most dangerous territory in Afghanistan, but Sarah preferred the honest threats of enemy combatants to the treacherous betrayal of her own people. As dawn broke over the mountains, Sarah reflected on everything that had happened since the mission began. She had been betrayed, hunted, and left for dead by the very people who had sworn to protect her. But she had survived, and now she carried evidence that could expose a conspiracy reaching the highest levels of the military command structure. The data storage device in her pocket contained the names, dates, and financial records that would bring down everyone involved in the illegal operations. Generals, colonels, and civilian contractors who had enriched themselves while American soldiers died fighting with inadequate equipment and compromised intelligence. But Sarah knew that possessing the evidence was only the first step. Getting it to people who could act on it would require navigating a complex web of military politics, media manipulation, and legal procedures. The same people who had tried to kill her once would not hesitate to try again, and next time they would be better prepared. As she moved through the harsh Afghan landscape toward her rendezvous with Captain Torres, Sarah Mitchell began planning her next moves. The people who had cast her into the water to die were about to discover that she had not only survived, but returned with the power to destroy them all. The real battle was just beginning, and this time Sarah held all the cards. Justice had been a long time coming, but it was finally within reach. The question was whether she would live long enough to deliver it. The rendezvous point was an abandoned Soviet-era bunker built into the side of a mountain, its concrete walls scarred by decades of warfare and weather. Sarah arrived 2 hours early, using the extra time to establish overwatch positions and escape routes. Trust was a luxury she could no longer afford, even with people she had served alongside for years. Captain Rebecca Torres appeared precisely on schedule, approaching the bunker alone as instructed. Sarah watched through her rifle scope as her former commanding officer moved carefully through the rocky terrain, obviously aware that she was being observed. Torres carried no visible weapons and kept her hands visible at all times, following protocols for meeting potentially hostile contacts. "Mitchell, show yourself," Torres called out when she reached the bunker entrance. "We need to talk." Sarah emerged from her concealed position 50 yards up the mountainside, keeping her rifle ready but not directly threatening. The two women had served together in Iraq and Afghanistan, developing a professional relationship built on mutual respect and shared combat experience. If anyone could be trusted with the explosive evidence Sarah carried, it would be Rebecca Torres. "You look like hell," Torres observed as Sarah approached. "How long since you've had a real meal or medical attention?" "Long enough," Sarah replied. "Did you come alone?" "As instructed. Though I have to tell you, half the Pentagon thinks you've gone rogue. The official report says you killed 2 American servicemen and stole classified intelligence. Sarah handed Torres the data storage device. The official report is part of the cover-up. Everything you need to know is on that drive. Names, dates, financial records, communication logs. It's all there. Torres connected the device to a ruggedized tablet computer and began reviewing the files. Her expression grew increasingly grim as she scrolled through the evidence of systematic corruption that reached the highest levels of military command. Jesus Christ, if this is accurate, we're talking about treason charges for at least a dozen senior officers. It's accurate, Sarah confirmed. I pulled it directly from the classified database at Chapman. The corruption goes all the way to the Pentagon, maybe higher. Torres studied the financial records that showed millions of dollars being diverted from military contracts into private accounts. Weapon shipments were being redirected to black market dealers who sold them to enemy forces. Intelligence reports were being falsified to cover up the theft of military supplies. General Morrison is named here, Torres said, her voice filled with disbelief. He's been recommended for promotion to Joint Chiefs of Staff. Morrison ordered my assassination, Sarah replied. His son Jake was leading the team that tried to kill me. This conspiracy is a family business for some of these people. Torres continued reading, her anger growing as she discovered the scope of the betrayal. American soldiers had died in firefights using weapons that had been sold by their own command structure. Medical supplies desperately needed in field hospitals had been diverted to civilian contractors who sold them for profit. We need to get this to the Attorney General immediately, Torres said. But we also need to keep you alive long enough to testify. The people named in these files will stop at nothing to prevent this information from becoming public. I've been thinking about that, Sarah replied. The normal channels are compromised. Too many people involved, too many opportunities for the evidence to disappear or for me to have an accident. Torres nodded, understanding the challenge. Military justice was designed to handle individual cases of misconduct, not systematic corruption involving dozens of senior personnel. The chain of command that normally processed evidence and protected witnesses was itself compromised. I have an idea, Torres said after a long moment of consideration. There's a journalist at the Washington Post who specializes in military investigations. She's broken several major stories about Pentagon corruption and has a reputation for protecting her sources. Media exposure could work, Sarah agreed. But it also makes me a bigger target. Once this story breaks, every intelligence agency in the world will be looking for me. We'll provide protection, Torres promised. Witness protection, new identity, whatever it takes. Sarah laughed bitterly. Witness protection run by the same people who try to have me killed? I'll take my chances on my own. The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of helicopters approaching from the east. Both women immediately took cover behind the concrete walls of the bunker, weapons ready. The aircraft were still several miles away, but in the clear mountain air, sound carried with deadly precision. Did you tell anyone about this meeting? Sarah demanded, training her rifle on the approaching aircraft. No one, Torres insisted. But your communication last night could have been intercepted. The helicopters were military. Sarah could tell by their distinctive rotor signature. As they came into view, she recognized them as the same type her former unit used for combat operations. Someone had tracked their meeting, and a kill team was inbound. We need to move, Sarah said, grabbing her gear. This position is compromised. Torres followed her up the mountainside toward a series of defensive positions Sarah had prepared during her early arrival. The rocky terrain provided excellent concealment, but the helicopters carried thermal imaging equipment that would eventually detect their heat signatures. Mitchell, this is Morrison, came a voice over loudspeakers mounted on the lead helicopter. You're surrounded and outgunned. Surrender now, and we'll take you alive. Sarah's response was a precision shot that shattered the helicopter's windscreen, forcing it to veer away from the mountain face. The pilot was skilled, maintaining control despite the damage, but the message was clear. Sarah Mitchell was not surrendering to anyone. Return fire. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio as the helicopters spread out to attack positions. Machine gun fire erupted from the aircraft, bullets chewing up the rocky ground around Sarah and Torres's position. The two women moved constantly, using every boulder and crevice for cover as they fought back with their smaller weapons. Torres proved herself to be a capable combat veteran, her rifle adding to the defensive fire that kept the helicopters at a respectful distance. But they were vastly outgunned and outnumbered with limited ammunition against aircraft that could hover just out of range. "We can't hold this position," Torres shouted over the gunfire. "Too much open ground, not enough cover." Sarah was already planning their next move. The mountain face above them was too steep for helicopters to approach directly, but it also offered no escape route for ground forces. They were trapped between the aircraft below and impassable terrain above. Unless Sarah used the one advantage the helicopters couldn't counter, gravity. "Follow me," she ordered, moving toward the edge of a cliff that dropped several hundred feet into a narrow canyon. "We're going down the hard way." Torres stared at the precipitous drop with obvious concern. "That's not a tactical withdrawal. That's suicide." "It's controlled descent," Sarah corrected, pulling rappelling equipment from her pack. "I've done this before in Montana. The canyon will give us cover from the helicopters." Working quickly under fire, Sarah anchored climbing ropes to solid rock formations and prepared for what would be one of the most dangerous descents of her life. The cliff face was nearly vertical, with loose rock that could give way at any moment. But it was her only escape route. Torres went first, rappelling down the cliff face with the fluid grace of someone trained in air assault operations. Sarah followed, controlling her descent while bullets from the helicopters sparked off the rocks around her. The aircraft couldn't get close enough for accurate fire without risking collision with the mountain. They reached the canyon floor just as Sarah heard the distinctive sound of fast ropes being deployed above. Morrison was sending ground forces down to continue the pursuit. The canyon provided temporary concealment, but it was also a trap that could be sealed at both ends. "This way," Sarah said, leading Torres through the narrow passage toward the eastern end of the canyon. "There's a trail that leads back to the main valley." The canyon walls rose several hundred feet on both sides, creating a natural corridor that echoed with the sounds of their movement. Sarah knew they had perhaps 10 minutes before the ground pursuit reached the canyon floor and began following their trail. They emerged from the canyon to find themselves in a broad valley dotted with abandoned buildings from some long-forgotten conflict. Sarah recognized the tactical possibilities immediately. Multiple defensive positions, overlapping fields of fire, and numerous escape routes through the surrounding mountains. "We make our stand here," Sarah announced, moving toward a partially collapsed building that offered good concealment and clear sight lines across the valley. Torres followed without question, understanding that running was no longer an option. They were going to face their pursuers on ground of their own choosing, with weapons and tactics that maximize their advantages while minimizing the enemy's numerical superiority. The first ground forces appeared at the mouth of the canyon within minutes, moving in coordinated fire teams that spoke of professional military training. Sarah counted at least 20 personnel, all armed with automatic weapons and equipped with the latest combat gear. "Morrison's not taking any chances this time," Torres observed, studying the approaching forces through her rifle scope. "Neither are we," Sarah replied, taking aim at the lead element. The battle that followed would be remembered as one of the most intense firefights in the history of special operations. Two women, fighting with nothing but courage, skill, and unshakable determination, held off forces that should have overwhelmed them within minutes. Sarah's precision shooting eliminated key targets, disrupting the enemy's coordinated advance. Torres provided suppressing fire that kept entire squads pinned down behind inadequate cover. Together, they turned the valley into a killing ground that their enemies entered at their own peril. But numbers eventually began to tell. As ammunition ran low and fatigue set in, Sarah realized they needed a miracle to survive the next assault. That miracle came in the form of additional helicopters approaching from the west, aircraft that bore the distinctive markings of legitimate military forces. "This is Colonel Anderson, Criminal Investigation Command," came a new voice over the radio. "All units cease fire immediately. You are interfering with an ongoing federal investigation." The shooting stopped as confusion spread through Morrison's forces. Sarah watched through her scope as the new arrivals surrounded the assault team, weapons drawn and ready for action. Captain Torres had apparently made additional contacts before the meeting, ensuring that backup would arrive if things went wrong. Within an hour, Morrison and his entire team were in custody, charged with attempted murder, treason, and conspiracy. The evidence on Sarah's data storage device had been transmitted to multiple agencies, ensuring that it couldn't be suppressed or destroyed. 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell stood in a federal courthouse as guilty verdicts were read for more than 30 defendants. Generals, colonels, and civilian contractors who had betrayed their country for money were sentenced to decades in federal prison. The conspiracy that had nearly cost her life was finally exposed to the light of justice. Morrison received life imprisonment without parole. His son Jake was sentenced to death for his role in the murders of Chun and Rodriguez. The military reforms that followed the scandal changed how supplies and equipment were tracked and distributed throughout the armed forces. Sarah retired from military service with full honors and a Presidential Medal of Freedom. She used her settlement from the government to establish a foundation that provided support for military whistleblowers who risked everything to expose corruption and protect their fellow service members. The people who had cast her into the water to die had learned a hard lesson. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell was not someone you wanted as an enemy. And when SEALs came back to settle the score, they settled it completely and permanently. Justice had been served, and Sarah Mitchell could finally sleep peacefully, knowing that the truth had won in the end.